Well, we'll begin tonight's show with a shock announcement by America's Mercury Digital Bank that it will be closing all business accounts in about 37 countries around the world. About 13 countries in Africa will be affected by this move. Now, effective from August 22nd, it's Africa's tech ecosystem, which is likely to feel the pain the most. Now, the California-based digital bank played a major role in helping startups get the funding that they needed on the continent. Well, let's find out more about this. We're joined by CGTN's John Terrett in New York and also a reporter at Tech Cabal, Ngozi Chukwu. They both join us to discuss this topic. Great to have you both with us on the show today. Now, of course, John, I'll start off with you. We know that Mercury Bank became pretty much the preferred banking partner for startups after we saw Silicon Valley Bank go under back in March. Is it clear what exactly is going to impact its users in these 37 countries?
Hi, Uche. Well, it's funny because it's a bit of a misnomer in many ways because they call themselves Mercury Bank, but as you say, it is really a digital bank. I think of them more as a fintech. There are lots of fintechs all over the world now, basically helping people with their various finances in various ways, but doing it through technology and increasingly, of course, through AI. Now, Mercury Bank has a couple of divisions. One is called Choice, the other one's called Evolve, and their website says that the aim behind the company is to really simplify banking, particularly for startups. That's where they got their start, helping startups, including in Africa. And the idea is to help you with your own bank account, if you see what I mean. Now, they say on the website they have top-tier venture capitalists behind them and 2,500 community members, as they say, supporting them. And they were indeed a hero. When they started in 2017 in San Francisco with about 500 staff, they were certainly hailed to be heroes for the work they were doing, and they've been expanding into consumer banking since 2019. But then the regional banking crisis hit. You remember last year, 2023, the regional bank issue, and you will remember Silicon Valley Bank fell over. Well, I remember on this program talking to you about Silicon Valley Bank because it was a major provider of startup capital and startup help for startups in Africa, but it fell over, of course. It was the first one to go. And I remember people in Africa, I remember you interviewing a startup person saying, well, what are we going to do now? Because it's not clear what's going to happen, whether the new management will help us in any way. And of course, that all attracted the attention of the regulators. That's what happened. They were looking the other way prior to the regional banking crisis, but then they sort of perked up their interest. And on closer inspection, looking at Mercury Bank, I think what happened was it appears as if there was some account eligibility issues. There were some compliance issues. And there was recently a very tough, tense meeting between the regulators and bank staff. And I think to boil it right down, the basic problem appears to be the difference between the address given by the startup and the location of much of the transactions that it was actually doing. I think that's the problem. So the upshot of all that, then, now Mercury is ending work in 37 countries, including 13 countries in Africa. The startups have been mailed by email with no real explanation for why they're being dropped. The 13 countries in Africa are Burundi, Cameroon, Central African Republic, the DR Congo, Liberia, Mali, Mozambique, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. And I think the focus is on Nigeria. And the reason is there is a sort of freewheeling bank system in Nigeria where the rules are not always observed. There's a liberal interpretation to banking rules in Nigeria, and I think it centers on Nigeria. But it does leave African startups at a real disadvantage, particularly those who need dollars to get going and to keep going and also want international cooperation and help as well. They will get their money back, but they'll be told to go on their way as of August the 22nd. And how ironic is it that a couple of years ago, Biden said he was all in on Africa when he hosted that big Africa conference in Washington, D.C. And now this is happening. I think it probably opens the door maybe to other countries. From the U.S. perspective, this is all about homeland security, but from the African startup perspective, this is a real headache. Uche?
Quite right, John. Well, let's bring Ngozi in on this conversation. Great to have you with us, Ngozi. Now, of course, as John just mentioned, Mercury Bank was pretty much became popular amongst startups following the collapse of SVB Bank. How much exposure do African startups, especially Nigerian startups, have to the bank? How are they going to be affected by all of this?
Yeah, so the bank did not quite share how many founders from Africa right, are banking with it. But we know that about 13 African countries are affected, and Nigeria is on that list. And Nigeria has a very robust African sort of ecosystem. So like a lot of founders here are actually affected by this. And these founders typically get funding from foreign investors. And most of them actually usually insist on them opening accounts in the US. Also founders prefer to open accounts there because they feel like it's a lot more safer there. Some don't have a lot of trust in the current banking infrastructure here in Nigeria. And these companies receive millions of dollars in funding from these investors. And they use these accounts to fund their operations, to pay salaries, to pay their vendors. And some of these companies need these accounts to facilitate their payments for their customers who frequently make foreign transactions. So yes, plenty of founders here are affected by this change.
And we'll delve into that a little further. But first, John, I want to get a sense of what you mentioned earlier, which is that these restrictions are all part of a regulatory crackdown on commercial banks right now in the U.S. Is it clear how wide-ranging the impact of these crackdowns will be on the sector going forward?
Well, 37 countries is quite a lot, and 13 countries in Africa is an awful lot, really, I think. We did have a warning, by the way, Uche, a couple of weeks ago, because the bank started to do the same thing to startups and businesses it was helping in Ukraine, where, of course, Russia's special operation is going on at the moment. And that affected accounts that Mercury had in Ukraine. But my understanding is that they were the accounts that are domiciled in Ukraine, based in Ukraine. If there was an account with the bank, for example, that was based in the United States, but working in Ukraine, then that account was not affected. And it may well turn out, actually, that this is the situation with the African startups as well. In other words, if there's one which is, based in Africa and working in Africa, that might be a problem. But if there's somehow a startup which is somehow based in the United States but doing work in Africa, then that may be a different matter. We'll have to see. Obviously, this is not just going to be confined to Mercury Bank, because the regulators were given a sharp wake-up call when SVB went over last year, 2023, and they're obviously now looking in detail at all of these regional banks and financial tech companies. So I think if you are a startup in Africa, or you're thinking of becoming one, then buyer beware, as it were, because I think any new applications going forward are going to be revised and reviewed under very different political circumstances. And I think finally a word for people who engage in startup companies. I mean, most people have a good idea that they think can work and will make a lot of money for themselves and for other people. So they say, I'm not working for the man anymore, or indeed the woman, I'm not working for the woman, I'm going to go out on my own. And then they find that they're actually working 18, 19 hours a day. They get no sleep. They have to be responsible for the premises, the phone bill, recruiting staff, keeping staff, and they only ever get any credit once they prove that they actually have any sales for whatever it is that their business is in. So, spare a thought for startup people, because they're very, very brave and things don't always work out for them. And this situation, particularly for African startups, I think is going to make the picture a little less clear, at least for the time being, Muche.
And Ghazi, as you heard there, it could affect other banks going forward. And we know that banks such as Mercury Bank are important to Nigeria's tech startups. They, of course, raise dollar funding from foreign and local investors, and these banks are important to that process. So how significant is this development, not just with Mercury Bank, but to the wider sector going forward?
Yes, like John said, it will be a lot more harder for companies from this side to prove that they're actually legal, businesses, because the bias that already was existing before is now a lot more pronounced, right? But for now, some companies have begun to find alternatives. Some have found banking in RECs, and some are turning to local, providers here in Africa. So yes, the journey really has become a lot more difficult for these founders, but there is still some hope, especially since there are local companies here that are trying to provide the services for them here in Nigeria.